Shabbat Shalom. San Marcial was a beautiful little town in New Mexico. It was situated about 20 miles away from Socorro, which may or may not be useful to you. If you don't know anything about New Mexico, that probably means nothing. More or less in the middle-ish of the state. Now, San Marcial was mostly a farming type community. There were a lot of shepherds and herdsmen. It was a very nice community. And it was destroyed by a flood. This wasn't the first time that there had been serious floods in that area, but this was the last time that San Marcial would be there for the flood. As the floodwaters came in so fast, so destructive, the entire town was wiped out, and the survivors did not go back. They set up in Socorro and other towns, and that was the end of San Marcial. You can still go there if you're willing to drive down some dirt roads and see tiny bits of building here or there, wood strewn, a few other signs of what had once been a home for so many people, but now nothing but the New Mexico desert. Now, why do I know so much about San Marcial? Because San Marcial is my family's home. My family, as many of you know, on my mother's side, are from New Mexico. Originally from Mexico, originally from Spain, and then going further back, my mother has the previous 35 generations mapped out. So we can talk about the family history, but quite recently, up until the destruction of San Marcial, my family lived there in New Mexico. After San Marcial's destruction a little over 100 years ago, well, the family moved to Socorro and began to decide, and eventually, of course, my great-grandmother, my Nana, left Socorro, went to Los Angeles, and from there, my family history is really more familiar to me. But the flood of San Marcial always remained a part of our family history, our family lore. There are songs that are still sung by the people who remember San Marcial about its destruction. There are people who still say, I'm from San Marcial, but we live in Socorro now. This is still part of the wider Gallegos memory within our family and our extended cousins and cousins and cousins. But what do we make of a disaster like that, or the more recent disaster in Texas, which didn't wipe out an entire town but has claimed the lives of hundreds, and hundreds are still missing? How do we approach such tragedies? Where do we find God in the midst of something like this? Or the fires in Maui, or earthquakes, or hurricanes, or the other great disasters that continue to bedevil our planet? Well, to understand a little bit of this, we're actually going to have to go back and look at someone else who also struggled to understand. We're going to look back at the most famous prophet, I think for most people, because we talk about him every single week, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah. At the end of Havdalah, we are acknowledging again that Elijah, as the forerunner of the Mashiach, of the Messiah, is able to arrive again. Because we know that being a good Jew, he's not going to be traveling on Shabbos, but now that Shabbat is done, our hope for the redemption is rekindled. Well, who was Elijah? Well, he was a prophet, primarily of the northern kingdom of Israel, after the civil war that had divided our country following Solomon's death. And he lived during the time, most famously, of Ahab and Jezebel, which, if you know other names of kings of Israel, that might be one of the ones you know, if only because you remember Ahab from Moby Dick, if only because you know Jezebel, because she becomes a byword for a terrible type of woman. Well, he was not a hunter of whales, and she was not a woman of loose virtue. They were both terrible tyrants and despotic rulers. And they introduced idolatry very, very strongly, and the worship of Baal very, very officially as state policy in the north, driving out the worship of Adonai. Prior to that, idolatry, of course, had thrived up there, sadly, but it was alongside of continued worship of Adonai. For them, no. they were going to be, quote, monotheistic, in the sense that they would pick one of the pantheon to worship, but it was not going to be Adonai. And in the process of imposing their religious views upon their entire country, they murdered all those who spoke on behalf of God. They murdered all of the prophets, but not Elijah. Elijah escaped. Elijah continued to teach. Elijah continued to show up and to warn Ahab about the penalties that would come for his behavior, continued to bedevil him. Finally, Elijah decided that he needed to make a point, because the entire northern kingdom was getting ready to descend irrevocably, he felt, into this worship. He had to take a stand. So he showed up, even though he was sort of the most wanted. And he stood before Ahab and said, look, you want me, I'll give you me. But we're going to have a little contest. We're going to Mount Carmel. It's up in the north of Israel. You can still visit that area today. And we are going to have a prophet showdown. The priests of Baal, all hundreds of them, they'll have a bull that they'll do a sacrifice of, and I'll have a bull that I'll do a sacrifice of, but neither one of us gets to light the sacrifice. Whoever God is real, that will light the sacrifice. So we will set the stage. They'll even go first. And they did, and they jump about, and they gash themselves and bleed, and they plead, and he mocks them. Maybe your God's, sleeping, shout louder. And of course, nothing comes. Nothing happens. Their altar remains completely unburnt. Elijah not only sets up his altar, but then has them soak it in water over and over again until it is completely dripping wet, obviously not going to be susceptible to a match. And then he says, God, the entire nation has forsaken you. I alone am left. Let us show them. And fire from heaven lights the altar, and everyone goes, woo! Adonai is the real God. Wow, that's great. The next day, Jezebel finds out about all of this and sets her hunters against Elijah, and he ends up running all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula. Long way away. It turns out that the people's support is rather fickle, that they're not willing to back him up against the king and queen, and so he has to leave or he will be murdered. And he ends up back at Mount Sinai, all the way back to where we began as a nation. And there, he takes refuge in a cave, and a voice comes to him. He says, Elijah, what is here for you? What are you doing here in the middle of Sinai? God appointed you to serve the people, not to hide in a cave. And Elijah says, I am the only one left of all of God's prophets. I'm the only one who remains zealous for God. Everyone else has fallen. And God's presence passes in front of the cave. That should be triggering some memories. The same thing happened to Moses, when he wanted to understand God's ways, of who God was compassionate to and who God punished and how God chose when to do each. Moses too had God's presence pass in front of him. And as Elijah is there and the presence passes, there is an enormous wind. But God was not in the wind, says the text. And there is an earthquake. The entire room, the cave, is being shaken. Boulders being split. There is a fire, a huge conflagration outside that cave. And God was not in the earthquake, and God was not in the fire. And then, Kol Demama Daka, a still, small voice speaks to Elijah again. It says, Elijah, what is there for you here? And Elijah says, well, I'm the only one left. I'm zealous, and I'm the only one who's standing up for God. And he fails the test. He gets a gold watch, in this case a fiery chariot. He is told to pass on his mantle. He appoints the next king, and pretty much he is wrapping up loose ends, and then that's the end of Elijah. The end of his story, at least as far as we're concerned. There's a whole much more we can talk about, but For our purposes, that's the end. But what did he fail? I mean, what was God trying to teach him at that cave? What's with the wind and the fire and the earthquake and God not being present in any of them? Well, the problem is that Elijah still believed, much like everyone else, that you would find God most powerfully in those moments of power. That in those disasters you would see the hand of God. In the fire you would see the finger of God. In the earthquake you would be able to read the will of God. And God was trying to tell him, you thought some fiery service up on Mount Carmel was going to change everything? You think I never thought of maybe if I do a few more fireballs, maybe a few more lightning bolts, a couple more earthquakes, then everyone will come flocking back to me? You really thought that was where people would discover God? That I would humble them with a disaster, and then they would know who was their God? That I would shatter their idols, and then they would beg forgiveness, understand that they had been sinners, turn on all of their crimes, rip Jezebel apart, and then return to me. You think I never thought of using power to do that? And you think that would work? If you think that's going to work, then that's all you're going to be doing from now on, and that means you're no longer the prophet for me. And so, thank you very much for your service, and there's the door. And then he appoints Elisha, and the story goes on with the next one. When we are faced with disasters, it is very tempting to keep asking ourselves, was this God, or where was God? Let's deal with that first question first, because unfortunately there have been far too many people, for not just the floods in Texas, but for other disasters that have gone on around the world and in our country especially, where people want to ascribe God's will to the tragedy. Well, you know, the people who live there, they blah, 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 blah. They do this, they do that. And that's why God sent down this plague upon them. That's why God struck them with the earthquake, with the fire. I mean, after all, come on, you don't have to be a genius to realize that Hollywood, sin, there must have been the fires in California, even though, of course, it wasn't Hollywood that got burnt. But that doesn't stop people from projecting what they want to believe onto the disaster that has crippled so many others, of using it as an excuse for their statements, not for God's. Because God is not in the fire. God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the wind, something we know far too well here in Orlando with hurricanes. That's not God's will being expressed in some prophetic way to help instruct us in our moral behavior. If you want to know what God wants us to do, we don't have to read the tea leaves of disasters, we read the Torah, which is a lot nicer to read than trying to sift through the remains of people on the banks of a river and glean from their bodies what we did to anger God so. How inhumane and how irreligious to imagine we can speak for God over the bodies of the dead as though somehow the dead deserved what has happened to them. God is not in the fire. God is not in the wind. God is not in the earthquake. Where was God for Elijah? Kol demamadaka, in the still, small voice. After the disasters, that is where God was, telling us, save them, rescue them, heal them, rebuild for them, or move them if that is not a place to be rebuilt. Design better structures that can withstand or move them to places that will not be prone. We have the technology, we have the wisdom to be able to tell where these types of disasters are likely. We have the ability to withstand a certain amount, and what might happen beyond that, we avoid. It's not rocket science. God gave us a brain to be able to understand this. He gave us a world that could be understood by our brains. No. God is right there weeping with us as we bury our dead, and right there inspiring us to do better for those that come next. God is there to offer consolation, and God is there to offer guidance for how we avoid such tragedies. God is that still small voice inside of us saying, this is terrible. we have to do something. And do something we should. But if I am right, you are probably still also wondering, okay, so God wasn't wielding the storm like some pen in the sky to give us a message. But why didn't he stop it? Why didn't God prevent it? Why did God allow this to happen? Or fires, or earthquakes, or hurricanes, or plagues, or other issues? Well, obviously this takes a lifetime of study and discussion, but I will give you the short answer. Because we deserve to hear this, and we deserve to understand what it is, so that when others tell us that all of these disasters are there to show God's displeasure, we can say, no, it's to do something else. Now, first of all, we have to acknowledge that a lot of the things that we call suffering are not actually suffering. Oh no, I can't buy a Rolls Royce. I suffer so terribly. There's a lot of things in life that we want that we don't need. There's a lot of things we want that if we had, we would be more unhappy. The alcoholic wants alcohol. Give them alcohol, they are going to be worse off. So, we have to understand from a baseline that we really should be focusing on true suffering, not on the things that we just complain about. That takes care of an awful lot of social media and would ruin our tech industry, but hopefully for our spirits, we would do better to keep that in mind. All right, so once we get rid of the things that aren't actually suffering, but we just either think we want, or if we had them, we'd be worse off, then we have to deal with the simple fact that we are alive. We are living creatures. We are made out of flesh and blood, and that means we break. This is a part of being a changeable creature. If you were unbreakable, if you couldn't get sick, if you couldn't break your leg, if you couldn't feel bad, then you would be a statue. Worse than a statue, because even a statue can at least erode. You would be a static entity, like the angels. No will, no actual feelings, because feeling implies change, but simply existing in some state of non-change. Well, that's not what God wants for human beings. He wants us to be able to live, to change, to grow, to feel, to love, to have all of the experiences of this world, and that means we have to be susceptible to damage, because if we can't be damaged, we can't be better. It's one of those horrible paradoxes of our existence, and yet there it is. And so when things happen, like too much rain falls from the sky, or the winds blow too hard because of this material world we live in, well, things are going to break. If you stand in front of a truck, you will be hurt. That's not because God wants you to be hurt by the truck. It's not because God is sending the truck against you. It is because a truck versus human body ends in only one version. So, we have to avoid the truck. For much of human history, we've spent very little of our considerable brain power actually trying to figure out how to avoid these true disasters, and instead have focused more on how we can hurt each other, or how we can get an advantage over each other, or how we can just enjoy more of our indolence and hedonism, but actually working to figure these major problems out. We haven't done so much. Last 100, 150 years, we've done better, and we're living better. Our buildings stand up better in earthquakes. Coming from California, I can tell you that from personal experience. Our buildings are more resistant to the storms that are around us. We are more capable of defending our structures against fires. We are getting better at this. And we will continue to get better at this, but we still are going to have to recognize that sometimes there are going to be illnesses, injuries, and disasters that we cannot fully prevent from happening, because we are going to break. But apart from just breaking, apart from the things that we think are tragedies but aren't actually tragedies, it's just our own sense of greed, entitlement, etc. Well, there are some things that just feel, I don't know, excessive, that feel more than they ought to be. All right, fine, it has to be that we are able to change, but does there have to be childhood leukemia? Do there have to be genetic defects that will prevent a child from even being born or taking the first breath? Are these necessary parts of what God wants? Well, no. They are not necessary, because if we are able to cure them, prevent them, treat them, they will go away and we will not be thwarting God's will. If we are able to remedy all of these most painful problems in the world, God will cry in joy alongside of us. Every time we create a new vaccine to stop a disease, God celebrates us as his children. Every time we develop new techniques to feed those that are hungry, God laughs with joy that we are finally using his gifts well. Every time we overcome these most painful of problems, God is happy. If we thought that God sent these as punishments, if we thought God sent these as some deliberate attempt to teach us some magical lesson, then we would be paralyzed. We would not be able to treat. Doctors would be outlawed. Engineers would be criminals. How dare you thwart God's will? If God doesn't want me to be run over by a truck, God will stop the truck. Nonsense. God doesn't want you to be hit by a truck, and God doesn't want you to be hit by a plague, and God doesn't want you to be carried away in a river. God wants us to be safe. God wants us to live joyfully in the world that we have been given. And ultimately, that's going to be up to us. If we listen to that still small voice crying out to us to say, I'm not in the fire, I am in how you prevent it and what you do after it. I am there in the heart of the person who dives into the river to save someone. I am not in the river sweeping a child away. That's just meteorology. Study it. Use it. But don't think that it's my will that the rain rises a certain level at this point and falls at another point. Recognize that that is the world that we are in, because to do otherwise would mean you couldn't be human, but be human and fix it. And where you can't fix, be human and weep alongside those who suffer. That's what the voice is telling us. But you know, that's hard. Much easier to use a disaster as a way to posture in your theology, as a way to try and gain points over your rivals, something we've talked about a great deal. Much easier to use a disaster as, well, they must have deserved it. After all, righteous people don't suffer, say the friends of Job. God gave us the entire book of Job so we would know what nonsense that was, so that we would see a righteous person suffer for no reason of their own. So that way, anyone who tells you they deserved it is saying a lie, saying slander, and they are blaspheming God. To point at a victim and say, God did that to them because, is to desecrate God's name. So with Texas, at San Marcial, with the fires of Maui, and all the other disasters, and COVID and other illnesses that I'm sure will still continue to plague us. Listen for that voice, calling us to arms before the disaster hits, and calling us into each other's arms when the disaster hits. God has given us the ability to save each other from all of the turmoil of this world, and given us the ability to have compassion for each other when, as of yet, we are still incapable of saving all. Listen to the voice, not the fire, wind, and earthquake. Shabbat Shalom.